Sigur Whitaker is our speaker today. Sigur is the president of the Rotary Club of Norfolk. Sigur grew up in Indianapolis, followed her brother in the local high school there as the editor of the world's oldest daily high school newspaper. After high school, she followed her parents, grandparents, etc., to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and matriculated there for her bachelor degree and her MBA degree. Currently, Sigur is self-employed copywriter specializing in financial and auto racing industry information. In her life before that, she was an associate of Chester Long's as a senior VP in commercial division in their common banking. Sigur is an accomplished author. Her two books include James Allison, biography of the engine manufacturer and Indianapolis 500 co-founder. That was published in March of 2011. And in 2014, she published Tony Holman, the man who saved the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. That was April of 2014. Without further ado, I'll turn it over to Sigur.
Thank you so much. I don't think this is on, is it? Can you hear me without it?
Yes.
Okay, great.
No.
No? Yes?
Not
No?
everybody can.
Okay. Okay, I appreciate everybody being here this morning, and I'm delighted to tell you the backstory of the Indianapolis 500, Indianapolis Motor Speedway. I'm going to transport you back to 1890, or the 1890s. And I know that most of you are sitting here going, well, you know, cars weren't around in the early 1890s. But in fact, the story of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway begins back then. It starts with three young men who were just beginning their careers, and they all belonged to the Zigzag Cycle Club. The first one was Carl Fisher. He was a guy that loved both bicycles. He loved to race, and he formed a company with his two brothers repairing bicycles. And it didn't take long for Carl to figure out that he could make a lot more money if he would sell bicycles rather than just repair them. So he went to Cleveland, Ohio, and got some bicycles to sell, and the rest, as they say, is history. The second guy was Arthur Newby. Arthur Newby, with a friend of his, formed a company, and they made chain link for bicycles. And it was Indianapolis Chain and Stamping, and they became one of the world's largest bicycle chain company. The third guy was a guy named Jim Allison, and Jim's story was a little bit different in that he joined his family's firm, Allison Coupon. They made coupons that were sold to mining companies and that sort of thing, kind of a way of doing money transactions without dollar bills. And Jim Allison loved to ride his bicycle, but he wasn't in the business, so to speak. So in about 1989 or so, the League of American Wheelmen came to Indianapolis. That was a bicycle group for their national championship. And they needed, among other things, a place to race their bicycles. Bicycle racing in the 1890s was big time stuff. And so Arthur Newby and Jim Allison got together and they built what was called the Newby Oval. The Newby Oval was really a spectacular facility. There was seating for 20,000 people in the grandstands. It was built of white pine. They had concerts, they had fireworks, and they had racing. And the racing was really fabulous that particular weekend. Unfortunately for the Newby Oval, it wasn't really a good business. And it really wasn't founded as their own business because they had other things they were doing. So in 1899, the world of bicycling came to a startling halt. There were a lot of manufacturers out there. The price of bicycles crashed, and basically Arthur Newby sold Indianapolis Chain and Stamping, and as a young guy, probably in his late 30s, he retired for a year. Nice life. But anyway, the next thing that happened was Carl Fisher. Automobiles came into Indianapolis in the late 1890s, and Carl Fisher was one of the early adapters of the automobile. And in 1900, he went to the auto show up in New York City, and he was very smitten with the automobile, and came back to Indianapolis with the first dealership selling Buicks. And he very quickly added other automobile titles to his line of businesses. So he transitioned from bicycles to cars, and Arthur Newby, after about a year of retirement, joined with a couple of his friends, and they started the National Electric Motor Vehicle Company. So they also got into the manufacture of automobiles. Jim Allison just kind of stayed with the company business, Allison Coupon. He also was very frustrated with the state of writing pens, and so he started the Allison Perfection Pen Company. Fast forward to 1905, Carl Fisher and the other guys go to the Indianapolis State Fairgrounds, Indiana State Fairgrounds, to an automobile race. Most of the races those days were on dirt tracks. The Indiana State Fairgrounds has a mile circle, so they were racing on that. And as they sat in the stands that day, they started talking about having a 24-hour race. And lo and behold, this talk turned into going to really doing it in November, not the best time to do a race in Indiana. As you can imagine, it was bitterly cold. And they only had 2 participants, both of which were driving nationals, which by then were electric gasoline engine cars. And they set a new world's record for 24-hour endurance race. But the next thing that happened was that Carl Fisher went to England in 1907. And in England, they were building the Brooklands auto racing course, which was a famous racing course. And it was about 2 3/4 miles circumference. It wasn't an oval, it had a different shape, but it was made of concrete, had high banking. And Carl Fisher came back to Indianapolis talking about this race course and how he really would like to establish an auto racing facility in Indianapolis. Indianapolis had a lot of carriage makers back in the 1890s, and a lot of them transitioned into making automobiles. And in fact, Indianapolis was a major competitor to Detroit. And I know most of you didn't know that, but they were a major, major competitor to Detroit. There was a real race about which town was going to become the automobile capital of the world. And Indianapolis certainly wanted it, and they had hopes of making Indianapolis into this great racing facility. I'm going to step back a minute and tell you in 1904, Carl Fisher and Jim Allison joined forces in a company that became known as Prestolite. They made the original power source for car headlights. It were tanks made out of acetylene gas, and it provided a steady stream of lighting, and it made both men very, very rich and very successful. So they started talking about building this racetrack, and now all 3, Arthur Newby, Carl Fisher, and Jim Allison, were involved in the automobile industry. So in 1909, Carl Fisher goes on a road trip to Dayton, Ohio. That's about 90 miles away from Indianapolis. His car breaks down. It has flat tires. It breaks down again. He is so frustrated, and I'll tell you that Carl Fisher used very colorful language. With him that day was an Indianapolis realtor, Lem Trotter. And Lem got tired of hearing Carl complaining about the state of automobiles and talking about building a racetrack. And he said to Carl, well, why don't you go on and do it? And Carl responded, well, go find me some land. Well, Lynn Trotter, being a real estate agent, that was all he needed to hear. And he found what he considered to be the perfect piece of land. There were 320 acres, 4 different parcels, about 5 miles northwest of Indianapolis downtown. And he came back and he said, I've got the perfect land for you. Carl Fisher goes to his buddy Jim Allison. They talk about it at lunchtime. Jim Allison says, I'm all in. They go to Arthur Newby. Arthur says, I'm all in. They had a 4th person in Indianapolis who was involved in the automobile industry, Frank Wheeler. Frank was the president of Wheeler Schlebler Carburetor Company. He says, I'm in. And there was a 5th guy, Stoughton Fletcher, whose family owned the big bank in town. And Stoughton, who has also been involved with some automobile racing type things, said, oh, I'm in too. His family said, no, you're not. This is not a good thing for a banker to be doing. So Stoughton quickly dropped out. They hired Park Andrews as the architect for the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. And it originally was going to be about 3-mile circle oval. And Park said to the guys, that they they didn't have enough room at the outside for people to mill around and to have proper stands. So Park encouraged them to drop the size of the motor speedway to 2.5 miles, which, as you know, it is today, and that's the way it was founded. They had a small problem when they were doing the construction of it, in that there was a stream that ran through one corner of it, so they needed to build some bridges. One thing about Carl Fisher is that he always had, he was one of the 24/7 guys. He always had hundreds of ideas. When he plowed into something, he did it full force, full steam ahead. He didn't know the word of planning or taking it slow and easy. So he set a very aggressive schedule for the construction of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. Racing was supposed to start in late June, and the first races that were held at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, in fact, were balloon races. Carl Fisher had a pilot's license and was very enthusiastic about it, thought it would bring in lots and lots of money, and it didn't. The people of Indianapolis very quickly figured out that we can watch the balloons rise up to the air just by standing outside the track. We don't have to pay to go in. So you know, that wasn't a very exciting thing for the guys in recouping their money. The second thing they had was the motorcycles were also big, and they were going to have a motorcycle convention in Indianapolis, and so the track was going to be used for the motorcycles. Well, the track originally was made of crushed stone and oil, and the people who were on the motorcycles came through town on their way to another race in Cleveland and said, you know, we really don't think that this is going to work very well. We're really kind of concerned about stones flying up and hitting us. And Carl Fisher, as Carl always did, assured everybody that everything would be fine. And the guys came back, and there really weren't any serious accidents, but a lot of the racers dropped out. And it wasn't exactly the kind of day of racing that they thought it would be. About 2 weeks later, in the middle of August, the first races at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway started. And back then, the races were all small. Well, I shouldn't say they were all small, but they consisted of 5-mile races, 10-mile races, and then they had a feature race that would be 100 miles, 250 miles, that sort of thing. And the first day of racing, you know, the cars were very, very heavy. And the first day of racing, the track didn't hold up. All of a sudden, the corners, and particularly as the cars would go around, started to crumble. There were potholes that were developing. There were accidents. The sanctioning body for auto racing was the AAA Contest Board, American Automobile Association, and they came to Carl Fisher at the end of the day and said, you know, this just isn't going to work. There were 3 days of racing planned, and Carl Fisher said, I'll fix the track overnight. So he brought back in the heavy-duty rollers to roll back the track back down, put some more oil on it, and he also covered the ditches that lined the outside of the speedway with board. The second day of racing came, and it was a good day. Nothing happened. It was a very good day. And on the second day, they had an increase of attendance. The first day, they had about 20,000 people show up. The third day of racing comes along, and it is an unmitigated disaster. They had multiple wrecks. There were five deaths. 2 riding mechanics. Every race car had a person with another person, riding mechanic with them. There were 2 spectators that were killed. There was 1 driver that was killed. The AAA contest board stopped the big name race, which happened to be the Presto Light race, in the middle of it and said, we're closing down the speedway. Well, you know, the guys had a problem. They had invested a lot of money in constructing this track out of good Indiana farmland, and they said, what are we going to do? And they decided that they weren't going to throw their investment down the drain. Instead, they decided to explore whether to make the track of concrete or bricks. And they brought in some, they laid some concrete, they laid some bricks on the track. They fastened a national motor vehicle to it, ran it so it was spinning its tires, and decided at the end of the day that they were going to repave the speedway with brick. 3.2 million bricks were laid in record time. They opened again for racing in December. If you thought Indianapolis was cold in November, December is even worse. The day opened, it was in the teens. It was not a good day for racing. And one of the things unique about that day was that they had implanted a gold brick in the speedway, which in fact was one of the brainstorms of Carl Fisher. He was quite the marketer. But the brick really wasn't gold. It was really a composite made of a carburetor, bronze and some other material. But it garnered great attention, and they put it in the downtown Indianapolis department store window after the race was finished. But the racing came off without a hitch. The next year, they had scheduled 4 weekends of racing. The first race was over, weekend of racing was over Memorial Day weekend, and it was a great week. They had a lot of people show up, races went well, the track held up well. The second racing group was 4th of July. Well, lo and behold, not that many people showed up. And so the guys once again got together and started thinking, well, what are we going to do? You know, we had great racing the first weekend. Second weekend, the racing was great, but the crowds weren't. They decided to cancel the third weekend of racing, which was an endurance race, 24 hours. And then they decided the fourth weekend, they shortened it. And the fourth weekend was over Labor Day. And once again, it did not perform particularly well in terms of attendance. At the end of that, the guys got together, decided to talk about it. Well, what are we going to do now? And Carl Fisher wanted to do more racing. Jim Allison wanted less racing with more dollars charged per race for people to enter and to attend. And Arthur Newby sat there and said, you know what I think? I don't think it's a good idea to have a 24-hour race. I think we ought to have one race and make it something very spectacular. And it ought to be, you know, people would come for about 6 or 7 hours, and that's about 500 miles long. And so they announced to the world that the Indianapolis Motor Speedway was going to host the Indianapolis 500. And that occurred the next May. Why May? A couple of reasons. First and foremost, that had been the most lucrative part of when they had started their racing over the three weekends that they had. And secondly, that was in between the planting season and the harvesting season. It was also in Indianapolis when it is more likely to be fairly temperate in temperatures. It can be really hot. It can be not so hot. But, you know, it avoided August and September and July. And from there, the Indianapolis Motor Speedway hosted the Indianapolis 500. The thing that set that race apart and made it the race to go to was that they offered the biggest prize money that was out there by a long way. They offered $20,000 in awards for the first year. So that's the backstory of the Indianapolis 500. Jim Allison, Carl Fisher, and Arthur Newby, along with Frank Wheeler. Y'all have any questions?
Wow.
Yes.
When you think of Indianapolis, you think of open wheel racing. Why is it that that's what races in Indianapolis? Why is it like stock?
Indianapolis doesn't race stock cars. There's a backstory to that one. Mr. France, Bill France, was that his name, with NASCAR, had wanted to race some racers up in Indianapolis at the Speedway, and they had turned him down and not made him feel particularly welcome. So he said, well, I'm going to go off and do it myself. And so, you know, he started NASCAR, and that's why NASCAR started. And as you know, in the 1990s, NASCAR came to Indianapolis, and they have a Brickyard 400 there now. So they do have stock car races, but only once a year. Yes?
For someone that doesn't watch racing all the time, when it's on, what in particular do you look at? What do you keep up with? I mean, 4 or 5 hours is a long time. What do you look at?
Most of the races aren't 4 or 5 hours. You know, most of the races are much shorter, 2 to 3 hours. And I find myself really interested in who's leading. If you're an aficionado of auto racing, what you're really interested in is the strategy behind the auto race. And all teams have strategies about when they pit, when they pit for new tires or gas, when they pass. There's something called a push to pass button that they can use to ramp up their energy to their engine. You have a limited number of times that you can use that. So they watch that. I'm more interested in the strategy behind it.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thanks. We've
Yes.
got one more quick question.
I have a friend that lives in Indianapolis, and the year they went to the Jets, he said it was strange to drive by when they were practicing, all you heard was a whoosh,
That's true.
because it's real loud, those cars, they don't want to go loud.
Yes.
Why did they switch in the first place, and why did they switch back?
They switched in the first place. One of the things about the Indianapolis Motor Speedway is that it was really founded as a test track for automobiles. And that has continued to this day. And so it's for a lot of people, it's all about the innovation. And the turbines were an innovative part and thought that they would sweep the world. And the same thing happened to the turbines as happened to the Offenhauser engine. The turbine put the other engines in the dust. The other engines weren't competitive, and so the Indianapolis Motor Speedway decided to make the racing competitive, because if it's not competitive, people aren't interested.
Thank you, sir. I know you know the 4-Way Fest.
I
But
do.
here's a mug with our logo on it as opposed to Golfer Club.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before we do that, I neglected to give the floor to Chester for our educator moment. Chester, would you like to take a moment?
Okay, thank you, Dave. 2 weeks ago, we talked about April being magazine month. And so the educator moment today, I'm going to defer to Sigur, because Sigur has an article. She's president of the Rotary Club in Norfolk this year. She has an article in another publication that we talked about a couple of weeks ago, and that's the Rotary Foundation District Newsletter. So Sigur's club got a grant, and they do literacy work. So I've asked her if she would talk briefly about how they went about the grant process and what they did with their grant that they got through the Rotary Club in Norfolk.
We had always given grants to people, and last year we celebrated our 100th anniversary and decided to do something really special. Most of our grants are fairly small in the dollar amount, but we wanted to make last year special. And so we attended the district grant seminar and found out about the matching funds that could be available. And we had a grant application to put in a computer lab into a Title I Norfolk Public School, elementary school. And we sat there and said very quickly, you know, this would be a great way to leverage our money. We, in fact, were going to do 2 literacy labs. And so we put in $5,000 of our money, and the district grant put in another $5,000 to fund the Tidewater Park computer lab. The thing that impacted our club is that we always gave our grants out and didn't have the grant making process until late in the Rotary year. We would start discussions in May, and you have to have your grant decided by, or applied for by early May, I believe it is. And so having gone to the grant seminar, we basically have restructured how we do our grant applications, and we now do them in late April, early May, instead of making the decision in late June. And we, again, this year are going to apply for a grant. There are different components you have to have, including community involvement that involves your your grantee, I guess. So, you know, for us, it's been great, and it's something that I think is a wonderful thing to do.
Great. Thank you so much. Let's have you draw our winning lottery ticket or raffle ticket.
I'm going to make a friend.
Maybe.
Last two numbers,
Three.
That's 3 numbers.
006.
Who's got it? I think that's you. You think it's you?
Inside job.
All right. Yeah, inside.
Wait a minute, wait a minute.
All right. Phil's got it. All right, folks. Thanks so much.